Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
We have the privilege today to be with Emily Greenhouse, who is since 2019 the editor of the very prestigious New York Review books. She has a long career before. She's with Lyon University, and then she worked in Paris for Granta magazine, in London then, and then she was the editorial assistant of Robert Silvers at New York Books. And then she was the editorial assistant of David Rumnick at The New Yorker, and so on and so forth. And then she joined Bloomberg briefly for politics. And then she went back to The New Yorker as a managing editor. And finally, now she is the editor of the New York Review books since 2019. So you have this very long experience and career in the world of editing in prestigious magazines like Granta, like The New Yorker. What do you consider yourself? A writer, a journalist, a magazine person? Because your father was also a famous journalist.
Yes, that's a good question. Whenever I meet with young people, which I love to do, to talk about how I made my way here, quote unquote, I always say that I sort of zigged and zagged my way, and I'm not someone who had the intelligence or the articulated ambition to know exactly what I wanted to do. I thought I was going to be a writer. My father's a labor reporter and worked for about 40 years for the New York Times, writing about the plights of workers. And that just seemed like an extremely respectable and noble, human rights forward thing to do. And I expected I'll do the same thing. And in college, I realized I was sort of more oriented toward what now gets called longer form, but I guess sort of creative nonfiction. And it's been a great privilege, mostly to be identified, I guess, by first my wonderful former boss and dear friend, David Remnick, and then the publisher of the New York Review, Ray Hederman, as someone who could be an editor and who had that kind of creativity. I love to play with words and with language, and language is very alive to me. And I work as an editor, and I'm always surprised at how satisfying I find it as a creative pursuit, because I don't have a byline, but I really enjoy it. And to your earlier question, I mean, I certainly hope that I can stay here for a good long time, as Bob Silvers and Barbara Epstein did. I think it's one of the most liberating and liberated jobs in publishing today.
After a European experience, which was similar to the one of, he worked for the Paris Review, you worked for the Granta, but similar to the one of Robert Silvers and Barbara Epstein. Even if the New York Review books is a monthly magazine, right? It's a huge job. Because what you just said, to be very precise, accurate, the writing, quality. I think that Robert Silvers was obsessed by that.
Absolutely.
No? And he probably taught you this way of total commitment to the review.
Yes, I was hugely privileged to work for him. As I'm sure you visited the old office on Hudson Street, he had this enormous horseshoe desk, and then just a sort of field of computers in front of him. And he would have 4 or 5 assistants at a time. And when I was his assistant about 13, 14 years ago, I was the one girl assistant, and he was a hugely gracious and courteous person, but he wouldn't say, "Good morning, so-and-so, good morning, Emily, good morning, Christopher." He would just say, "Dear David," and you would just scurry to your computer and start typing madly. And it was that way from the moment when we called to wake him up at 9:30 or 10 until 1, 2 in the morning. And he was completely obsessed. That is the word for it. And I think I started this job the week I became a mother. I had a child, my wonderful 6-year-old son now, the week that I started. And therefore, it was kind of necessary that my obsession would look somewhat different. And I think, having worked at a larger magazine in the intervening years, The New Yorker and at Bloomberg, and having had the experience at Granta, I'm aware that this is a different moment in the working world, and that when you work with people, you have to give them more affordances. So I think I try to bring people in who are similarly obsessed. Bob had his brilliant hands on every single article that was published. And I think the work that I have done here has often been to open the place up and allow other editors, including the brilliant editors, our executive editor, our deputy editor, and a number of senior editors who worked with Bob for decades, empower them to do what they maybe weren't doing under Bob. They were learning so much under Bob, but in ways the former model, let's say, could be a bit stifling. So a lot of my obsession has been the obsession with the people in the office and trying to find the best editors and the best writers. Because I think for me, the more people you have reading and reading and reading Catholically, the more you're learning about who's very alive to different subjects and the changing nature of text in this crazy, unanticipated era.
In this world of artificial intelligence, of bombardment of news everywhere, from everywhere, when the newspapers, maybe not the New York Times or very, very few newspapers, but most newspapers have a difficult time. Many magazines have a difficult time. You are not a tiny literary review or a smaller niche publication, but what happens with the New York Review of Books nowadays? You still have many readers? What kind of readers you have? Are readers buying the physical New York Review of Books, or they read it online? How does it work? Can you tell me a little bit of that?
Sure, of course.
Because the world has changed so much since Bob Silver's and your time.
I'm very conscious of that. Fortunately, I think that artificial intelligence, which is not coming, it's here, I don't think that it will affect our report, our magazine, as much as it will some places that are faster or that have more of what's called sort of the service component, more about what to buy, what to look at, who's hot now, et cetera. I think that what we really, really privilege is the mind of the writer and what the writer thrills to or what outrages the writer. And it's a necessarily human thing. That is what we're interested in. Of course, the publishing landscape has changed and will continue to change. I don't think that there's going to be enormous disruption in that sense for the review. We're very lucky we have about 130,000 subscribers. What newsstands, you're speaking today from Milan, obviously in Europe, there's still a culture of newsstands. In the United States, in New York, there are bodegas. There are still newsstands on the street where you can buy Pepsi Zero, but we don't really see the magazine on newsstands. So it has to be something that you subscribe to or that you go to a bookstore for. That's something that I find a bit distressing. As I said, I started this job at 32 years old. I'm 38 now. And I think that the culture that Bob and Barbara were regal figures of the mid-century intellectual skywriter culture. It was very exclusive and it was very clubby and it was very, I don't want to say in crowd because I don't think there was a false posture or pretentiousness to them, but it was certainly what young people now would say, if you know, you know. It was something that everyone wanted to be a part of. If you were a scholar in Los Angeles, you certainly would subscribe to the New York Review of Books to know about what was being discussed and what the pressing issues were and how analysis was being treated, et cetera. Many, many different subjects that Bob and Barbara took up with vigor. I think we're living in a different ecosystem now, and we're very lucky to have our ardent subscribers in their 50s, 60s, 70s, sometimes 80s. We have a good number of writers who've been writing for the Review since it was created in 1963, who's continue to write now, who are in their 90s and as lucid as ever. It's remarkable to have Robert Paxton and Neil Asherson and writers of that lucidity and caliber at any age contribute to us. I am mindful of the need to reach out to a new generation, by which I don't mean people under 25 necessarily. I often mean people under 55, people who are in the academy now, people who are in college and graduate school. And we're kind of thinking about ways to present them with our magazine as a place of extraordinary rigor and vigor and hopefully intellectual delight and something that is supposed to, and I think does, incarnate intellectual curiosity. I don't have anything more than a bachelor's degree. Many of our contributors are far better educated than I am, but the kind of education that we mean to value and to espouse is the education of a mind that is alive to the world of ideas and the ideas that are changing. And that's really what we're trying to do. So I'm in my way. We come out 20 times a year, so it's a small staff and I'm very busy. We're very busy, but we're certainly trying to expand our audience, not an immersive.
But you're not like the New York Times. You're not coming out every day.
No,
you're not like the New Yorker. You're not coming out every week. So you're monthly.
We come out every other week for most of the year. So it's certainly different from the New Yorker. I can speak to there are hundreds of people who work at the New Yorker. We have 16 people and 2 interns from the City University of New York, and it's very small. We do have an online report. Our brilliant online editor, Max Nelson, and formerly Ratik Ashokan, and soon starting tomorrow is Nora Kaplan-Bricker. And we do have an online arm that includes fewer book reviews, but not far more, because we have a lot of standalone essays in print. But Bob always taught me that it's not so much the final word, but the authoritative word, that the reading public can wait for it. And even if we're never the first to publish a review deeming Jonathan Franzen's new book better than the last or overinflated or whatever the case may be, we will publish something very thoughtful, and we're waiting for that particular writer to bring his or her mind to bear on the book. So we're not in a great hurry. We want to have, again, it's not a competition, but we want to have something that will stand the test of time, that will really ransack the book under review. But we do publish a lot from around the world. I think it's a very cosmopolitan magazine.
How do you decide what the next issue will be? Even if a review comes later or about an exhibition or about a book or something, but what is the mixture? You talk about books, but you also publish long articles about subjects.
Absolutely.
And therefore you're not only literary, but you're also political in a way, scientific, it depends. How do you decide what next review will be?
That is the great fun, that kind of curating. You know, in every issue, we like to have a number of history pieces. We certainly like to have a number of literature pieces, fiction, poetry. We like to have philosophy, science. Ideally, I would like to have an article on the environment in every issue. There are many subjects that we're trying to include. Sometimes we have graphic novel, which is a way of telling stories visually. We certainly have an arts piece. We like to have as much as possible opera, music, etc. That can be the newest opera, Aida, at the Metropolitan Opera here in New York. It can be the Bang on a Can Festival. There are many different things. I consider myself more of a political thinker and person than strictly literary. And so very often what motivates me and what I sort of shape an issue around is the politics piece, is the piece on the falsification of elections in Mozambique, or since October 7th had a tremendous amount. And I have focused very, very keenly on the war in Gaza and what has been happening in Gaza. I've had the privilege recently of working with the scholar Omer Bartov at Brown University, who's one of the leading scholars of genocide, on what has happened in Judaism, in Israel, in Palestine, in the world after the war in Gaza. In the issue that we come out with shortly, we have a reported piece from Ukraine. Alma Guillermo Prieto has a long history of writing from South and Central America for us. And I think that the way I'm looking at the issue is, okay, we have to have this piece. Very often now it's Fintan O'Toole will write on the political events in the United States with bracing clarity about what is happening and no fear in stating what we see before us, the norm-shattering, completely destabilizing, utterly immoral presidency of this country right now.
You are a left-wing magazine, you're a left Democrat magazine, or you don't like to have a label?
You tell me.
What I want to know is this. You mentioned the war in Gaza before, right?
Yes.
The war in Gaza, not only among Jews in the diaspora, around the world, but opened a vast division on the American left, for instance, right? There's a lot of questioning there. So how do we face these different Jewish voices, let's say?
Yeah. Bob and Barbara were Jewish. I am Jewish. We all have different relationships with Judaism. I think that it is certain, Bob grew up in a more Zionist household than I did. And I think that we're all very shaped, of course, by our families and our upbringing. To me, Tony Judt is, there is Chomsky, there's Isaiah Berlin. There are many, many voices that have contributed to the New York Review and shaped my formation when it comes to the question of Israel and Gaza. I think that it would be fair to say that this is a magazine of the left, but I think it is a heterodoxical magazine. And in what we have published since October 7th, I'm proud to say that we don't publish people who necessarily agree with each other or who reflect my views or Max's views or Michael's views or Jana's views or the views entirely of our colleagues here. Perhaps the piece that I am most proud to have worked on since October 7th, or certainly one of them, in the summer of 2024, I worked on an essay with Arya Nair, the great human rights lawyer who started Students for a Democratic Society with Tom Hayden, who then led the ACLU and who started Human Rights Watch and later Open Society Foundations with George Soros. He comes at this question as a Holocaust refugee himself and as a human rights attorney. And he wrote a piece that was not a polemic, but it was stating why he believed that what was happening in Gaza was a genocide. It was extremely meticulous, extremely cautious. And I found it very instructive to work on such a piece with him and to see how it affected the conversations at the ICC, for instance, to see how it affected the conversations politically. I think it's really important to have these thundering moral argumentations of the more polemical variety. But I also think that the very, very sober, very careful essays like Arya's, and I've continued to work with Arya on this subject, and I'm doing a piece with him right now on Turkey and on Erdogan. I find that the most perhaps thrilling because it feels as though that's where we can really make a difference. And there's a great tradition in the New York Review of publishing human rights testimonials. Arya obviously himself has collected many of these testimonials. So I wouldn't say that we publish articles that would take the position of the American right on Israel and the war in Gaza. But I do feel that between Ben Rhodes and Pankaj Mishra and Noah Feldman and other contributors, people really disagree with each other. And I think that that's really healthy. I think that that's the mandate of the magazine. And it's something that we're a very jousty magazine. We're always fighting about what's good, what deserves to be covered.
We have a new event, right? We have, since a few days, there is a new Pope, who's an American Pope.
Yes.
And his first words were for peace. And he repeated this since he's Pope, that he would like to see peace in Gaza, the restitution of the hostages, and in the same way, he would like to see peace in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Are you going to dig into that? Are you going to try to understand who is this new Pope? What does he have in mind?
The first piece in the issue that I will be closing today and later this week is about the Pope and is about a world where there has been a bit of where the last Pope, the late Pope Francis, sort of represented moral authority in a way that we no longer see through much of the world. Obviously, his moral authority is perhaps different from that of ours, the head of the Catholic Church, but very much was a great moral leader and spoke to the poor. I really was moved by the way the new Pope, Pope Leo, we were joking in our office that among his friends, Pope Leo in his past life went by Bob, because we're all very accustomed to speaking to sort of worshiping, so to speak, at the altar of a Bob. I was moved that he invoked the exhaustion of the people in Gaza, because I do think that's a very human way of framing what Gazans feel like. It's completely horrific and they are exhausted, among many other things. So yes, I'm hugely interested in religion. And we have this remarkable piece on the nature of the papacy and the nature of moral authority in this time, and actually how Pope Francis did take on a lot of sort of surprisingly, a lot of moral authority within America and became, I wouldn't say a voice of resistance quite, but came to stand in opposition to a leader like Donald Trump.
I don't think this Pope has the same ideas of Donald Trump on the immigration, for instance, right? I mean, he already expressed himself on that subject.
Yes, yes,
But it
which
would
is
be
the voice we need.
interesting eventually to know how the White House today and the new Pope, both Americans, will live together, as there are many Catholics in the United States. It will be interesting to watch.
Yes, the role of Catholicism in American politics has been a fascinating thing. We published a couple of months ago an astonishing report by Mark Lilla, who's been following this for many years. And my understanding of J.D. Vance is certainly informed by his mode of Catholicism. And I'm not a scholar of Catholicism, but it is very interesting to see the way a certain group of Catholics is organizing and is changing American politics and is now in the vice presidency in the person of J.D. Vance. So yes, I mean, I don't expect that there will be any kind of grand showdown, but the pronouncements of the Pope on migration, and I think, we're heartened by this Pope to learn of his Creole background. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday about the Pope's mother and how educated she is and her pursuit of graduate education and of teaching. And then, of course, Pope Leo's time in Peru. I hope that he will be a voice of open thinking, liberal thinking on migration, as you say.
About literature, you said you're more into politics yourself. The review is also interested in books and literary books or essays or art historians' books. I mean, how do you pick up the books? There is a contributor or an editor who says, I want to review this book, or are you making a choice? How does it work? And you also publish books as the New York Review Books,
Yes.
right? There is also a publishing section.
Yes, our sister arm run by my brilliant colleague, Edwin Frank, which does operate independently, although we work very harmoniously together, but they do operate independently, which is important because very often our contributors are so impressed with the books that they put out and want to review them. But many of the pieces we publish are sort of not self-generated, but we'll have Eamon Duffy or a great scholar of a particular field who says there's an important new book on this, or Susan Tallman, a great art critic, will say there's a remarkable exhibition. Ingrid Rowland will say, it's COVID, but the Torlonia marbles are being exhibited to the public for the first time in however long, and I must write about it. Or there's an important new academic book about harpsichord in Austria in the 16th century or whatever it is. And so very often it is our contributors who are writers that an editor here, Bob, Barbara, me, anyone has admired and has made contact with and has begun to work with. It's something that they're excited, that they feel is an important new contribution. So a lot of what we publish is driven by the writer in that way. David Sally, who's a remarkable artist himself, has been for the past years writing tremendous interventions on living artists and not always living artists, but he has a wonderful piece in our fantastic new art issue on the sculptor Arlene Shechet. And that is motivated by him. He will see something, he will respond to it, and he will want to present it in that way and explain it. And I find it so wonderfully, elegantly elucidating to read articles like that. And then, of course, we are meeting constantly with university presses, with some trade presses. We're going over their catalogs of upcoming publications. And I guess there's just old-fashioned buzz about certain books and exhibitions and films and even podcasts. So we will reach out to people that we find that we think could bring their minds to bear on that.
Are you very much involved into this university turmoil that there is nowadays in the Ivy League universities in the States? I mean, all this new change, let's say since the Gaza war, there has been a big or Ukraine war, there is a bit change, right? In what happens inside the universities, many presidents had to resign. Now there are menaces from the government that they are not going to give money anymore unless. What do you think about this?
I am heartened that a few hundred university presidents have gathered together to state their opposition to these pressures that seem very much to try to degrade what this wonderful university system, which is extremely dramatically too expensive, but is really the jewel, I think, of this country, our university system and the freedom afforded to students. I think it's frightening. And, it is very, very, very complicated to try to untangle the accusations of anti-Semitism, the reality of anti-Semitism from this exploitation by the presidential administration. I think that it is our job to talk about complex things and allow them to be complex. So I would never say that there hasn't been any instance of anti-Semitism, but I think for the government to make this the pretense for this preposterous defunding and crackdown of our nation's universities is horrifying. And we're not explicitly, we work with a lot of professors, we work with a lot of scholars, we work with a lot of students. We're not explicitly involved beyond that, but it's of huge importance and interest. And to all of us who prize knowledge and expertise, it's very distressing. So I've been heartened, as I say, by the president of Harvard, the president of Princeton, the president of my alma mater, Wesleyan, who've really spoken out and said, I don't think some institutions, especially smaller ones, know where they'll get their funding if the stripping really continues. But to be removing money from Columbia's medical institutions, et cetera, these are places that are discovering life-saving drugs. And so I don't think you have to be fancy or have the vocabulary of Robert Paxton, a nonagenarian contributor to the New York Review of Books, to care about this. We all count on the research, the scholarship, and the medical care and implementation and research and innovation that is being produced.
But in a way, this is weakening America, right?
Without question.
Is weakening the idea of the excellency in America. And what is surprising, or not surprising, but it's a fact, is that in the Ivy League schools, whatever they teach, there are so many students who come to study there.
It is completely senseless. I wish that I could, even if it were a logic that I disagreed with, I wish I could say, protectionism is important to protect U.S. manufacturing, et cetera. But in the world that we're living in, and especially with students, international students, it feels, not because this is a Cold War era tool of democracy building, but yes, it is weakening the country. It is weakening the world. I have friends who are moving abroad. Of course, a lot of scientists who have lost their jobs, or, Macron is very smartly trying to tempt American scientists to go to France. That is happening. And I simply don't understand why this is being done. There are so many, from an economic vantage, which is rarely mine, but there are so many Chinese students who are paying full rate to come to schools in the United States. And as I say, the liberal arts system, I think, is really the jewel of this country. I'm a French citizen and considered going to school in France. It's much cheaper. It has a wonderful model, but to not have to know what you want to do, to not have to choose what you want to do until you're, 21, 22 years old is so freeing. And it's really just the pursuit of knowledge and inquiry for the pursuit of knowledge and inquiry. That is the best of what this country has devised. And so I just don't understand why these...
But there are many things that are difficult to understand. If you want to make America great again, why do you accept that the Qatar is going to give you the Air Force One, the new plane? Aren't these signs of weakness in a way?
The plan...
People who are witnessing or observing without a prejudice. It's not that we have a prejudice, left, right, Democrats, Republicans, it's more a question of what you see.
The plane that will then go to the Trump Presidential Library or Institute, you can't sort of believe it. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if that constitutes a white-collar crime. I don't think so. But the sense that it doesn't matter any politician who's prosecuted, who's convicted, when we look at the convictions of the president, when we look at what's happened with the Eric Adams case, which is a bit different, of course, but it is as though these norms and these laws no longer hold water to some extent. And it's quite shattering. I mean, I think that it may be difficult for an average person, a lay person, someone who's not a lawyer, like I'm not a lawyer. It may be difficult to understand, but it goes back to that Access Hollywood tape in which Donald Trump just stated his position toward the sanctity and agency of women's bodies and his desire to grab them, us. And I can't believe that so many people in this country saw that and thought that that's okay. This is the kind of person I want to vote for. And we're seeing in the second term it's kind of a vengeance tour. And I absolutely agree with you that there's great weakening and that there's nothing great being made.
Europe is watching at the United States. It has watched the United States for many, many reasons, including the quality of your newspapers, of your magazines, of everything, schools, science, with great, enormous interest, respect. And suddenly the peripheral countries are a bit amazed, surprised. They don't know what to say about what's going on.
It's very sad that I should feel such relief that our publisher is not a huge billionaire. We're not owned by a billionaire with his own or her own interests. And that, of course, we all feel worried at times. But I think that the work that we do here at the New York Review of Books and at many independent publications like the New Yorker, like the New York Times, like many, many others, that we need to state plainly what is happening. And it feels, there's a real defiance now in what we're doing. But I hope that Europeans will, and I trust that Europeans, being the readers that they and you are, will acknowledge and will read what we are doing and what we continue to do.
What would be really interesting is to know via your article, maybe, of course, we already do, but what do the American people want? Or want to be, what the new generations want to be. Is America going to be a pole of attraction as it has been for several generations up to a few years ago? For instance, in China, the universities are more excellent, and maybe the Chinese people will stay home instead of going to Cornell or to Princeton or to UPenn or Columbia, right?
Even, cultural exports, if this Hollywood tariff, whatever he's calling it, protectionist measure will happen, obviously cultural exports will change. I don't know. I mean, America is no monolith, and I cannot pretend to have any understanding of the way my fellow compatriots have voted. But it seems clear to me that that is changing and that this administration is gutting the Department of Education, is gutting the system of education. And, I believe that there is enough will to keep things together at liberal arts schools, at Ivy League schools. But my worries are for the very privileged, but they're not only for the very privileged, because everything is interlaced.
Do you receive many letters? Are the readers of your magazine, do they have rapports with you, not you personally, but with the review?
Yes, we have a grand tradition of publishing letters to the editor and of publishing exchanges, really heated, really erudite exchanges between readers and our critics and writers and essayists and reporters. And this is a very, very human endeavor. I often joke with my colleague Merve Emre, who's a leader at Wesleyan University and a wonderful critic for our pages, about how engaged our readers are with what we do. There's a lot of affection that we'll hear from our readers, and then there's a lot of contention and how could the critic take such a position? Or Sally Rooney wrote this about snooker and, I was at this tourney, or whatever it is. Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say that we're hearing so much about on this particular subject, but, Fintan O'Toole, among others, David Cole, Sean Wilentz, we've had many writers on the creep of authoritarianism. I don't know if you could even call it a creep now, or just a kind of out and out explosion. And our readers are hoping for more. I don't think people are coming to us to protest what is happening, but I recently was part of programming a series. We're doing some events now, online events about what the Democrats and what the American left should do. We had Pramila Jayapal from the Congressional Progressive Caucus in conversation. We had a number of labor leaders, Sarah Nelson and Astra Taylor and Zephyr Teachout. We had a number of legal scholars, Lawrence Tribe, Sherilyn Ifill, Pamela Karlan speak about constitutionality, the legality of this encroachment of what the administration is doing. And then we had a panel on immigration, which you raised earlier, Alain, with Hector Tobar and Francisco Cantu and Julia Preston. We are trying, just like everyone else, to make sense of what is happening. Unfortunately, there is so little sense sometimes to the decrees of the administration. It's so unclear who is writing these executive orders, where they're coming from, whether they are applicable. I mean, we were very heartened by the release of the detained Turkish graduate student at Tufts, Rumeysa Öztürk, the order by a judge that she be immediately released. But that is a month and a half after her abduction. So we're following this very, very closely. I don't think that, this is still a small organ. We don't receive letters from hundreds of irate readers or anything like that. Maybe it would be nice if we did.
But do you have the feeling that there is fear in America at the moment? There's a feeling of fear that wasn't like that before?
Yes, I do think that there is fear. I think that habeas corpus, these principles, just the abduction, the kidnapping, the deportation of students, of undocumented residents, and of some citizens is beyond chilling. There is a lot of fear. I've been reading my former colleague, Masha Gessen, whose work and whose comparison to their upbringing in Russia is bone-chilling. We published Tim Snyder, who's been very, very clear on the road to fascism and on what is happening. We have a piece in our new issue by Christopher Browning that says this is happening here. We work with scholars of the Holocaust, scholars of fascism, who say, look around. So I don't understand how anyone could be denying fear. I would be lying if I said that I was not afraid, but I think it is my job to produce the most courageous and truthful report that I possibly can. If someone wants to come for this periodical, then publishing an article that states and explains why what has happened in Gaza is a genocide from some of the foremost scholars of genocide in the world.
There is a lot of question mark about the very word genocide. There's a lot of polemics that, of course, the situation is bad, things are dramatic, the killing of innocents is also terrible. But on the word genocide, who has been applied to the concentration camps in Germany, not everybody thinks that the word genocide is appropriate. A previous pope had used this word. I think he was criticized for that.
Yes, we've certainly been criticized for using that word, and not all of our writers use that word. We as a magazine, we're so writer-driven that we really allow our writers to select their language, of course, their capitalizations, their spellings, etc. It is my belief that the war in Gaza has been a genocide, not exactly the way that the Shoah was a genocide, but according to the founding documents, according to the Geneva Convention and the United Nations, the definition of genocide. This was Arya Nayer's, the thrust of his article on this subject. But yes, I am not someone who obsesses. I'm not going to dig in on every single tiny word. I do feel strongly that what has happened in Gaza is a genocide. But there's too much made sometimes of diction. And I think that my care about language is really a care about truth. And I think that that is what this magazine needs to be. We're committed to stating really what is happening.
And what is happening in the world of books, ideas, what people are writing. There's so much going on one way or the other that maybe writers, I don't say they don't know what to write about, but they are overwhelmed by the news, by the facts that happen every day. So do you have a feeling that people read less, or that writers find it difficult to write today, or no?
I have a feeling that there is a great dilution of quality and a great devaluing of complexity. And I think that this magazine and the work I'm so privileged to do is a way of trying to assert and argue for the importance of complexity, the primacy of lengthy argumentation, and of giving a certain kind of attention. When people are on their phones, I'm not someone who watches a lot of videos. So I know that that's a very, very popular currency. But I think that people are receiving a lot of information, a lot of words, and that's not a priori a bad thing, but it is our job to assess where those words are coming from, who is positing, who is writing, creating, speaking those words. And I think that there's just in this rush to gain the attention of teenagers and of people in their 20s, and sometimes of people younger than adolescents, a lot of real thinking and critical thinking is being lost. So the New York Review has always stood for clarity and for complexity. And I certainly wouldn't speak ill of any of the wonderful other periodicals on which our work is often predicated. You know, we need newspapers to be able to publish these essays and these reported articles and these reviews. But one can see that there is a kind of TV networkization of some newspapers, or that there is a need to make some newspaper reports more like social media. And I think that, you know, we're always going to be a print magazine. We, of course, publish online and we publish everything we do in print online, but it's a slower and, I hope, very rigorous defense of quality and erudition and expertise. And it's not pretentious. And I think what we publish is very accessible and very delightful. But I would say that, you know, I really stand against the dilution of the quality of content that I perceive is happening in a lot of places. And sometimes it's very sad to say that simply the printed word, sometimes simply text, is under attack. But I feel that that's true to some extent, and that that's what we're defending.
Yeah, do you think that most people say that as much as the world of newspapers and magazine is shrinking or fading sometimes, the world of books is healthy? People still read books. I say this because the name of your magazine is the Review of Books.
I know.
So American people read books. I mean, you have the feeling that once they read a review of yours, then they go and buy the book?
Our magazine has never been interested in selling books. We're trying to talk about books, which is to say published material, published story, published, you know, novel, poetry, etc., as a manifestation of a human idea and of something that is released into the commons and that is then digested, read, appreciated, reacted to. Books were about books, and books are also a way of talking about ideas. I think that there are many people reading and buying books, but I think that it would be fair to say that with the changes wrought by the internet, wrought by social media, wrought by the algorithms, we can see the changes in book publishing, especially with KKR owning. I mean, book publishing is becoming increasingly corporate, and there are book publishers who are chasing social media influencers and celebrities. And I think that fewer chances are being taken and fewer slow, cautious edits are being made and fewer things are being fact-checked. So I think that there is a dilution of quality in some of the larger presses. That said, there is a lot of excellent material. It's heartening to see in ways more people being paid for their writing, even if paid less. There's a wonderful ecosystem of independent book publishers, and we are always covering Archipelago or New Directions. Or I've noticed recently in our meetings with publishers that there are a lot of reprint imprints, and that's certainly something that I cherish. But I also wonder somewhat if all this energy around reprints bespeaks a lack of new books, if that energy should be going to finding new people who are writing. And I think I find this all the time. I've seen it as one of my jobs here to help create a younger generation of critics. And I feel so proud that we have managed a kind of generational shift and kept the magazine itself and made it more youthful, more female, perhaps more racially diverse, while still very much being itself. When I'm reaching out to people who are writing, 800-word pieces or even long arguments on social media that I think have the cogency belying a real critical thinker, people haven't written at this form and at this length. And I wonder if some people who should be writing novels will turn instead to screenwriting. I think that it is becoming sort of more rarefied because we are living in a society that is devaluing a certain quality in the book. There are still many, many extraordinary, excellent books. I wish I could read all of them. I wish we could cover more of them in a sense. But, I think that book publishing there are many excellent things being covered, but I don't know that it is the healthiest part of our polity right now. And of course, I see it as a grand ecosystem. I think that there is some sickness in publishing, some sickness in newspapers, even in periodicals, and that it all contributes to a lack of investment in truth, in accuracy, and ultimately.
But this is also due to the fact that much before what happens now vis-a-vis the universities, that in the universities, people will, donors or people who give money or therefore the academics are more and more scientific people, technological people, mathematicians, and humanities are losing ground, everywhere in the world, in all the universities, in England, in Israel, in America, in Italy, there are less and less interest, but the humanities are very much neglected, and therefore what we call culture for young people, for students, la formation of a young person is now very different. And books that seemed until not so long ago fundamental readings for an education, they seem to be less and less important in the homes, in the libraries, in the schools, and all that. And so obviously people are less accurate. They write messages, a lot of messages, and they read a lot of messages, but this is not accurate.
Yes, we can see everywhere how that is harming our democracy. It's very dangerous. And I think that, the New York Review of Books is one small pebble in this quest, but that is what we are trying to constantly assert, the importance of the writer and of serious work that gets published for the vitality of the thinking mind and ultimately of the democratic government. I mean, lowercase d, of course, of a democratic polity.
I'm sorry, but I don't think that during the democratic, I am not talking about politics, I don't think this tendency was better. It's not only a question of politics. It's a question of cultural values. I mean, the tastes of the children, of the younger students changed. Unless some old-fashioned schools, I'm not a Francophile, but, like the French lycée, where they still teach classics and, they insist on also to have a humanist culture. There's less and less interest in the young people about that, because the interest is about technology, appearance.
Yes.
So you become more and more of a niche in the sense that you go in an interesting way, because I admire you for that. You go against the wind.
Yes, I think that is what the magazine does. I think that there's so much.
Democrats or Republicans, or you know what I mean?
I do.
It's above that. I believe literature is above politics. It's not necessarily politics.
When I say democracy, I'm not referring, when describing the importance of literature, to voting blue. I'm referring to, I think that much of what has happened in the United States is a cleaving away from what is actually true and from what is actually fact. And I think that it no longer matters to people, and there's less local press, and there's less knowing who the reporters and writers are. I'm speaking there of lowercase d democracy. separately, but not completely separately, I would argue, is yes, there's much less interest in literature and in the cultural heritage that we all share. That's very, very concerning. It was heartening 5 years ago after the murder of George Floyd, the kind of resurgent interest in James Baldwin. The Review has had the great privilege of publishing Baldwin. I think that, there's a real trendiness for whatever reason around writers like Susan Sontag and Joan Didion. And I think that the Review has published those writers, and there sometimes is interest in public philosophers in that sense and public intellectuals. But yes, I mean, what was I just reading saying that the late Supreme Court Justice's favorite book was La Mort d'Arthur? It's a different culture. And I think, I don't want to say that we pursue rarefication, but yes, I mean, a kind of refinement and cultivation and literary culture is certainly being turned against in some way. And it's sad.
It's also an incentive to fight, to spread the voice that humanities are important.
They are.
Otherwise, life will become more and more dry and less poetic. This is a personal feeling. I am interviewing you.
No.
What is interesting is what you do. Thank you for the time you gave us.
Alain Elkann interviews.